Good afternoon and welcome to our latest LD EduChat. Today we're looking at early career teachers and looking at how we can support teachers into the profession. And I know that there's a lot of angst about some of the changes that are coming within the early career framework and changing from this 1 year to a 2 year program, and lots of sort of questions that raise over that. So I think obviously the aim of today is to give some insight into how we can make sure that our entry into the career is an area that we can thrive in and not just survive, as Abby and Amy are going to be presenting today. So we've joined by Abby Bayford and Amy Bills, who are going to be guiding us through some really useful bits and pieces as we sort of go into our career. Now, in terms of housekeeping and a few bits and pieces, today's webinar is being recorded, so this will be uploaded to our YouTube page and shared out via Twitter. If you aren't following us on Twitter at the moment, please do so at Chiltern TSH or Chiltern Learning Trust. If you search for either, you'll find us. For the proceedings for today, there's opportunities to engage with our speakers. So you've got the opportunity to ask questions. So around the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a tab for Q&A, as well as the chat function as well. So if you want to talk with each other in the network, by all means, feel free. That's within the chat function, the Q&A function. If you have any questions that you want to pose to either Abby or Amy, please feel free to do so. And we'll pick those questions up as we go through. So if there's something that you ask a question on that is relevant to that moment in that conversation, we'll pick that up live. But equally, we'll save and we'll answer some questions towards the end of the session as well. So without much further hold up, Abby, I'm going to pass over to yourself.
Thanks, James. I was going to say lovely to see you all, but I can't. But it's lovely to have you join us. Real privilege to be part of this series. So I'm Abby Bayford, Director of Institute at the Academy Transformation Trust. We're a national trust of 21 academies spanning 10 local authority areas. And I also am currently doing a secondment at the Teacher Development Trust as an expert advisor. I've been teaching 14 years, probably looks like it's been a little bit longer, working in the West Midlands. Previous to my role, I was vice principal at a school just south of Birmingham, and I've had a variety of leadership roles within the Sandwell local authority area. So I'll hand you over to my partner in crime, Amy.
Thanks, Abby. Afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Bills, and I am part of the Academy Transformation Trust with Abby, Regional Education Director. So I'm responsible for our primary academies, mostly based in the West Midlands, but work very closely with 3 other regional directors across our primary and secondaries. And I've had the absolute privilege of working particularly closely with Abby over the last 12 to 18 months on our early career framework. And you'll also see from the notes there, it is my absolute privilege to be a fellow of the Chartered College. So massive advocate for their really important work there as well.
Thanks, Amy. So what we wanted to talk to you about this evening is, as James said, how we can ensure that you're having the most successful start to what is a really amazing career and one that I've enjoyed for 14 years so far. But there is a plethora of great advice, but it's also really overwhelming as well. And so when Amy and I took on portfolio leadership responsibility for early career teachers across our trust, we started off by putting the programme together, mostly through retrospective insights, in all honesty. Lots of do's, many don'ts. We must make sure we talk to them about this. Remember when this happened? And we kind of said to each other, why don't we know these things about you? Why don't we know that these things happen to each other in our first year, the good and the bad? Why do we stop talking about our first year of teaching? And this is how the idea of our book, Letter to My NQT Self, was conceived. We said, okay, so if we think that these insights are important and helpful to our colleagues who are just joining the profession, how can we best share that? Started out as a blog and then very quickly gained traction on Twitter, and we were very fortunate to secure a contract with John Catt, and I was able to edit it. It's got some fantastic contributors. If you get a chance to take a look, not just ATT colleagues, but lots of really seminal educators as well who've contributed to that. What you're seeing at the moment is a treasure map. This is probably what happens when a secondary colleague like myself decides to work with a primary colleague.
Guilty.
Yeah. He ended up with a curriculum that was presented as a treasure map. But I wanted to show it to you because we've been thinking about teacher development for a really long time, thinking about how we can curate the very best possible experiences, but also what that might involve. So, the early released early career framework materials, been hugely helpful to us in establishing our core curriculum. But also it's really important that colleagues have an opportunity to craft readiness. So we're a big advocate for preparing thinking, making sure that colleagues have an opportunity to engage in things asynchronously as a way into learning, lots of post-webinar PD activity experiences, but also lots of wider experiences that we've put together for colleagues as well. So Amy, if you could just go to the next slide, I want to talk about some of the golden threads. So when editing the book, we realised that there are predominantly two golden threads that run through the book. The first is that exciting and shiny new things like teaching initiatives are amazing and really exciting, but can sometimes be a distraction and ultimately a poor proxy for learning too. And secondly, teachers that assume all pupils are equally capable of behaving successfully soon discover that they are not, and behaviour must be taught, and the habits and the skills that compromise successful class behaviour should be taught to all pupils. So we've structured the webinar this evening around those two golden threads, and I'm going to talk to you about the first one now, which is beautifully captured in Amy's letter in the book titled "Not All That Glitters is Gold." And I've shared one of the many powerful messages in her letter on the screen there. Amy, I wondered if you could just share with colleagues the key insights that you wanted to impart when you wrote that letter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we, as you say, Abby, when the blog started to gain some traction, I think the key for us was that gift of hindsight. And how we can support our colleagues with each other's hindsight. And that's not to say we've got all the answers, but I really wish someone had sat me down and said to me that this is not, every day is not showtime, and it is not about engagement and a buzz in a lesson without the core foundations underpinning that. So hopefully what we're going to be able to cover this afternoon is some of those core things that we wish we'd known. For me, I wish someone had said to me, what is it that you want your children to remember and to have learned from the lesson you are planning, and plan with that in mind. You know, that common misconception almost around an activity rather than that core learning. And as you say, those proxies for learning being what has been remembered or learned, not what has been done in that lesson. So, you know, if you're learning about the Stone Age, are they going to remember the facts, or are they going to remember the paper mache model and the gallery in the sports hall, for example?
Yeah, that's a really prevailing theme in the book, actually. And for speaking to our early career teacher colleagues, something that really resonated with them. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Amy? So I'm going to pause for a moment to give you an opportunity to read this fantastic quote by John Hutchinson. So John Hutchinson illuminates here the importance of all teachers having a mental model that guides our teaching practice. And in the example that Amy alluded to, there can be a tendency to focus on the superficial and visible what, as opposed to the why and how. That's certainly something that I was fixated with, well, definitely not just in my first year of teaching, actually, when I reflect back, but it was very much focused on, you know, what tasks do I need to do? How am I going to do that task? What does that task look like? And I definitely wasn't thinking about the how and the why children learn. And I really wish that I'd had the early career framework when I started out in teaching. If you could just go to the next one. Thank you. So I have just shared a snippet of the early career framework. I am sure you are all well aware of the early career framework, but it's a fantastic resource. If you haven't read it in its entirety, I'd really encourage you to, because it's great CPD in itself, reading through it. And it's a fantastic resource to use in guiding how we might build those mental models that John talks about that guide expert decision making. So many of you will be aware of the content of the framework, and this isn't intended to be a deep dive into that, rather a whistle-stop tour, but the statements are broken up into learn that and learn how to statements. We're really going to focus on standard 2 for the first part of this session. which links to how pupils learn, because actually the theme that ran through our book is underpinned by a lack of knowledge about how pupils learn, and that's why we've decided to focus on that standard in particular. To the left, I think it'll be left for you, I don't know now actually, but to the one side of the slide, I've also referenced concepts that it would be helpful to learn to build the substantive knowledge on the other side of the screen to activate that mental model that John Hutchinson talks about. So
on those mental models, Abby, sorry, as well, just I think from a classroom perspective, the absolute privilege in my role is to see the application of those mental models in lots of different settings. But actually, again, that beautiful gift of hindsight is if that mental model is going to be transferable, we really have to understand the model, not the application of.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into what I'm just about to talk about then, Amy, because in the first half of this webinar, I really want to explore some of those concepts through the lens of what contributors to our Letter to My NQT Self book and our early career teachers who've been on our pathway wish they'd known. So we scoped out their views, we canvassed what they thought, and they said, you know what, we really wish we knew those concepts heading into teaching. I'll also reference some seminal reading that might support any colleagues who are unfamiliar with these concepts. And I was speaking about this with Catherine Morgan, who works for the Teacher Development Trust yesterday, and we spoke about the fast fashion CPD culture that we have at the moment. And we're awash with initiatives, and whilst there may be real value in many, fads can sometimes go in and out of fashion. And you might be able to tell that I like clothes from all of the clothes metaphors. But what I would say to you as we progress through this session, whatever the teaching and learning models and strategies might be in the school or academy where you work, and the pedagogy you're introduced to, the concepts we're exploring this evening will have continuity for you in your teaching career. So they're things that have high utility. And as I said, we wish we'd known those in our first few years of teaching. So we'll move on to the first model then. As I've said, I'm not going to teach it you in its entirety because I'd probably need 3 sessions with Chiltern just for the first model. But it's really important we understand the simple model of memory. And Daniel Willingham provides a mental model of the learner. And when we surveyed the common persistent problems early career teachers face and considered insights from the letters in our book, a reoccurring theme is the age-old and quite soul-destroying "I can't remember" response. Or not even that, the vacant facial expressions when you question students about something they've learned previously, sometimes even from the same lesson. So maybe you taught them at the beginning and at the end you have some Q&A to see what they have remembered. And it can be really demotivating as a teacher. So what Willingham teaches us is, first of all, that learning involves a lasting change in pupils' capabilities or understanding. And that's very basically. He also teaches us about the important role that prior knowledge plays in how pupils learn. It teaches us that working memory capacity is limited and can be overloaded, which is evident in the anecdote I've just shared with you where children are saying, "I can't remember." But also the knowledge that we've acquired through thinking is sorted as schema or mental models. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide now. But something I also want to talk to you about is the order in which we learn. So I definitely, until quite recently, haven't thought about the sequencing of professional development in sufficient depth. So I might have thought, okay, this is the substantive knowledge that all teachers must have, simple model of memory being one of them. But what I haven't necessarily thought about is, okay, what must someone learn in order to acquire the relevant knowledge for the next concept? And I can't take the praise for coming up with that idea, because that came out of a conversation with Kat Howard, author of Stop Talking About Wellbeing and co-author of Symbiosis. But she really taught me about the order in which we acquire knowledge of these concepts as teachers. And quite rightly, she highlighted that we can only understand schema prior knowledge and all the other concepts I'm going to talk to you about when we have a secure understanding of the simple model of memory. So this is how we're approaching the sequencing of people development for our teachers in our trust. So many definitions of schema. I've particularly liked David Didow's. I think it's the English teacher in me, maybe, with the excitement about the web metaphor. But beneath that, Nick Rose captures beautifully when prior knowledge can be harmful to learning. I had not thought about that for a really long time in my teaching, but where prior knowledge is weak, pupils are more likely to develop misconceptions, and this might be because ideas are introduced perhaps too quickly, superficially, but it might also be because we're committing the wrong things to the long-term memory. And so we really need to think, well, what are the implications here? So if we could just move to the next slide. Quite a lengthy extract, but I want to give you a couple of minutes to read this because Willingham really hits the nail on the head here. Okay, so this is a really fantastic article and you're going to get a copy of this presentation afterwards and it's hyperlinked. But at the end of, or towards the end of the section in this article, William concludes, it is vital to know what you're going to want to remember later because that dictates how you should think about the material. And that most of the time, teachers want students to know what things mean. And so the advice offered to students should centre on the ways to help them think about meaning and avoid study methods that do not encourage them to think about meaning. That really resonated with me when I read this article. So what I definitely didn't think about in my first few years of teaching is specifically in a granular way what I wanted to commit to the long-term memory. So I'd think about, I don't know, knowledge or a concept holistically and think, okay, I just want them to know this concept. But I didn't really think about the nuance, you know, specifically what aspects of this model are really important for the children to retain and which aspects, you know, help to paint a picture, but they're not necessarily really fundamental. And what we can't presume is that pupils will just know which parts are the most salient and then commit that to the long-term memory. So it really changed the way I planned when I read this article, because I started to, like, as I said, get really granular about what I was teaching, the important knowledge, and think, okay, how am I going to draw attention in my teaching to the right things in order to signpost for pupils what they needed to commit to the long-term memory. So I think that, you know, that was a real turning point for me in my teaching career. If we could go to the next slide, Amy.
If I can, Abby, I'm going to flick back just for a second, because on this, you know, it's really important here on picking pupils' misconceptions. And particularly, you know, where we are at the moment, what we know is actually let's plan with those misconceptions in mind. So, you know, to give a couple of classroom examples, let's plan with full expectation that there may be some pupils in the room who would say to you, we add a 0 when we multiply by 10. Let's plan with that in mind, and let's be really proactive around the misconceptions when building the schema.
Totally agree. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to even attempt to try and teach cognitive load theory. I don't even think I'm qualified, but I do want to draw your attention to it as a model because I think it's helpful. It is quite contentious at the moment, So some people are contesting it, saying, why do people even need to know cognitive load theory? It's really unhelpful. But what I'm going to draw your attention to is an aspect of the theory that I think is really helpful. And again, from speaking to colleagues, canvassing the opinion of our early career teachers, this was another light bulb moment for them. So, and if you want a really amazing explanation of this, Zoe Enza has recorded a video where she talks through cognitive load theory in a really accessible way, and then gives an example of how it might apply to English, and I've hyperlinked that, and there's a great Chartered College article as well. So in terms of cognitive load theory, I think what's really, really important to think about in particular is the extraneous loads. So load generated by the way the material is presented and which does not necessarily aid the learning. So, for example, I recently had the privilege of observing one of our early career teachers, and he has said that he's happy for me to share this as one of many examples I could have chosen. He was teaching, quite a challenging concept in RE. Children were demonstrating a really great understanding of that through question and answer, and then he asked them to apply their learning through a gap fill activity. So they had all these really, challenging words for concepts on the right hand side, a passage, and they had to insert what they thought was the most appropriate word. The whole task just became about comprehension and syntax. Children were not thinking about what these words meant. They were not reading the whole passage holistically, thinking about the relationship between concepts. Some of them were guessing and then cheering when they got it right. But ultimately, the focus of that whole activity was around making things fit rather than demonstrating an understanding. And also, that activity took him 30 minutes to make. He could have had a really great conversation, for example, there's many other activities he could have done about those concepts, and it would have been far richer and helped to commit the right things to the long-term memory than the gap fill activity. So I'm just drawing attention to that particular form of cognitive load, because I think that whatever your view about that theory might be, it's really helpful to think about the task you're using to explore that knowledge and ask yourself, is it supporting the learning or is it adding to the extraneous load of it?
I think it's also helpful, Abby, to think of it in terms of distraction without wanting to add to the, any controversial views over it, because we remember what we had to think about. Memory is the residue of thought, right? So if there is a surprise element or a distraction, or to go back to our original train of thought, glitter, underneath all of that snazzy glitter, what is the actual core that we want to be remembered?
Yeah, and you're right. If you read our book, you will see so many examples of tasks that add to the extraneous load of learning. The glitter in my letter, I have a man dressed as Oberon jumping out of the cupboard. That's true, that happened. People don't tend to believe me, but it did. That definitely wasn't adding to the learning in any way. I'm sure the children won't forget it though. It certainly hasn't left me. So we'll just move on to the next one and talk about practice. Practice is really important. In fact, I'm sure isn't the phrase, not practice makes perfect, practice makes permanence, isn't it? If I've got that right. And so there are many different types of practice. So there's, retrieval practice, space practice, and so on. But it's really important to really get a sense of why practice is so important. So regular purposeful practice of what has previously been taught can help to consolidate material, help pupils remember what they've learned. So really evaluating how many opportunities am I giving children to practice. And if we practice receiving and using knowledge, then we can develop both its storage strength, how accurately we recall information as well, its retrieval strength, and how much effort and prompting we require to recall it. So requiring pupils to retrieve information from memory, for example, and then spacing practice so that pupils revisit ideas after a gap is likely to strengthen recall. Now, much of this is captured in Rose and Shine's Principles of Instruction. There's just a nice visual of that. I'm sure many of you have read it, but I would really recommend reading it if you haven't. It's a really nice, fairly simple, straightforward way of getting to grips with some of these concepts. Okay, let's go to the next, and the next one actually, Amy. So finally, so in my letter, I reflect on the important questions we might ask teachers we observe so that we can gather their insights and really delve into those strong mental models that they have. When I used to observe as an early career teacher, definitely didn't know what I was looking for. And actually, I hope this isn't too controversial, I'm going to say it anyway. I think the worst thing you can do is send an early career teacher in to see an expert teacher and just presume that it's going to have the impact that you expect it to, because you don't know what you don't know. So ultimately, you might be seeing an example of a really well executed teaching process, underpinned by a very strong mental model where you've got the teacher really thinking about in granular detail what they're committing to the long-term memory, the extraneous load of the task, the use of space practice, and so on. All of that is not shown in the superficial and visible what of the lesson. So all you're seeing is the task itself, the activity. And so it's not always as helpful as it's meant to be, because we're trying to gain insights ultimately into the strong mental models of expert teachers. And so ideally, you might have an experienced teacher come in with you who might be able to signpost particular things and say, notice how they're doing this. Why do you think they might be doing that? I wouldn't imagine that's always possible with things like cover. You might, if you have the technology, be able to record that lesson and watch it back together. Again, that might not be possible. So in the absence of all of those things, what you can do is ask really great pertinent questions of teachers who have expertise so that you can really tease out that the past library of experiences and the substantive knowledge that they're drawing on and that underpins the strong mental models that they have. So I am sure there are many more questions you could ask, but what we've put in the book, and I've put them on the slide here, are some really great questions you could ask teachers after having observed them, so you can gain some insight into their decision making.
And if I can, Abby, I'm going to be really annoying and go back once more again, because from a classroom perspective, those questions are so important when we're watching colleagues, and it's always a privilege to go and watch colleagues teach. When colleagues are watching you, give yourself permission to value practice in your lesson. And remember that pace does not mean speed. So we talk about appropriate pace of a lesson. And I know from, I remember in my NQT thinking, people are coming to observe me teach. I can't possibly let my children practice that for 15 minutes because I've got to move the pace of my lesson on. Children need that practice. Young people need that practice. When we learn, we need that time to practice. Give yourself permission to spend that time within a lesson practicing. And if you are fortunate enough to be in a school and academy where you are able to regularly sit in other people's lessons with really experienced colleagues beside you, pointing things out, really unpick that and really unpick the planning with misconceptions in mind. What misconceptions did you deliberately mitigate in that lesson, and how did you do it? Please show me. Because I think we must empower ourselves to seek as much expertise as possible and ask those questions.
I totally agree, Amy, and I wish I'd known all of these things then, because I'd have got far more out of the opportunity to observe teachers, and we just don't get to do it enough as we progress in our career. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, Amy, to talk about our second thread.
Yeah, so thanks, Abby. As we said, we kind of, The gifts of hindsight was the theme, and those mental models for teaching were a real big thread throughout the book, along with behaviour. And I think very often it's the aspect that perhaps creates the most anxiety for us as new teachers and as taking those first steps into our career. And unfortunately, one of the phrases that we hear quite a lot is, they're all right for me. You have that tough class on a Thursday afternoon, but they're all right on a Friday morning for whoever it is in a different department. You know, and we've talked a lot about, even if that may be the case, that is not a helpful response. And you will see, I think it's Haider's letter, isn't it, Abby, that is particularly brilliant with this. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's Haider's letter with that. A great colleague of ours. Such insightful wisdom on this. It is not a superpower, even though you may feel at times that it appears so with colleagues. And in this particular letter, Haider really unpicks that it isn't magic, but it takes a lot of work. And actually, equal to the classroom practice in terms of that teaching of knowledge, it's about that preparation and planning with it in mind. And it's around having a curriculum mindset when it comes to behaviour, because we have to teach it. It doesn't just happen. So, looking at the Early Career Framework Handbook, it is a fantastic, fantastic guide. Go and have a look at that chapter 1, because it really, really helps unpick managing behaviour effectively. I'm going to try and pick up on 3 concepts around that real curriculum mindset. We're going to unpick climate. We're going to unpick that planning deliberately of a curriculum. And we're going to have a think about consistency. And they are important whether you're thinking about planning maths, planning art, planning history, or developing that approach to behaviour management. Massive, massive shout out in here in the concept of crafting readiness. If ever there is a go-to person, Abby and I love Christine Council's work on curriculum. But if you apply that curriculum mindset, it also will help with behaviour. So we talk about climate and relationships. And you as a teacher are an agent of that in your classroom. You are a contributor to that in the school and the setting or the department in which you work. And you can control the climate. This here is an image of Death Valley. It's one of the hottest places on the planet. And there's a lovely story from Ken Robinson, if ever you have the chance to look at his TED Talk, where he talks about Death Valley. Never rains, nothing ever grows there, hence the name Death Valley. Until at one point something incredible happens and it rained for days and days and days non-stop. And in the months that followed, what was a previously barren surface had unique, vibrant flowers emerging from it, because the climate and the conditions for that growth were appropriate. Now, that is not to say it is all rainbows and unicorns. It is not. It is hard work, and you need to plan and craft that climate. However, what you can do is craft your readiness and your children or young people's readiness by making that really deliberate and planning for it. So I could share an image with you and ask you to pick out the strengths of that photograph. But you would look at it differently if I said to you, look at it through the lens of a photographer. Look at it through the lens of an artist. You might think of the colour. Look at it through the lens of a mathematician. You might think about the symmetry or the shape. And actually, if you make explicit to the learners in your classroom what it is you want from them, I think we are creating the climate where there is far more chance of success. So similarly, I could ask you to look at those rocks, or I could ask you to look for the bird. And if we go back to that image now you know what I want from you. What I want is for you to find the bird. It's all you can see, because I've made it really, really clear. I've set you up for success. Similarly, could ask you to look at the sky, could ask you to look at the makeup, the veins on the leaves, or I could ask you to try and find the bird and make it really clear from the beginning what it is I want you to see, which is the bird in the center of the picture. So that crafting of readiness is really, really important. And that helps with that climate, because what that does is that generates trust, because your children and young people will always know what it is that you want from them. And you can then maintain that really, really consistently. Another signpost for you in terms of real high quality, fantastic frames of reference. All hail Tom Bennett. So his great book, Running the Room, he talks about behaviour being a curriculum. It is a combination of skills and habits and aptitudes. We must teach them. And I love that phrase, teach, don't tell behaviour. It goes back to those mental models that Abby unpicked with us towards the beginning. And we can teach that in the same way. It's a curriculum mindset. We craft the readiness. And similarly, we must allow ourselves to spend time practicing that. Practice the routines. You know, if you're going to use signal, pause, insist, you need to teach that. And you then need to practice it. And your children, young people in your classroom need to master that as much as they need to master and practice calculation, for example, because it's all crucial to the learning. Rehearse those routines. Allow yourself the time to practice that with your classes, particularly if you teach different groups of students across a day or across a week. Empower yourself with the time to practice that and talk to your mentor about that. It is as important in terms of the running of your week as it is the planning of your core curriculum, or however you might discuss it. So rehearse those routines and set yourselves up for success. Equally, another thing I really wish I'd known was if I was not obsessed with glitter, the behaviour in my classrooms would have been far better, far earlier, and far more conducive to pace across the curriculum. Because by seeking to have an engaging, glittery lesson, I was adding to the extraneous load for my children, which meant they were far more easily distracted, which meant I thought that behaviour was far worse than perhaps I could have created the climate for them to operate in. So I think if we can master some of those real core foundational models for effective teaching and learning, that comes hand in hand with creating a climate in which our children and young people can be successful and can therefore behave or adapt in a way that you need them to in order to support you with that behaviour management. So they go hand in hand. I love this. Are they engaged or are they just well mannered? Are they present in the learning, or are they so well behaved and compliant that however they're actually mentally truant?
Amy,
that's a real point. Yeah, Abby?
How does teachers know, in your opinion, the difference between the two?
For me, if you are really skilled with questioning and assessment for learning in the moment, and you yourself are really clear on what the indicators will be of that learning, you can use those questioning strategies to gauge that. So when you ask your children, let's pause and reflect on what we've just talked about, have they remembered, can they articulate, for example, the function of the organs in the digestive system, or great example from Tom Sherrington building on Rosenshine, is all they can remember which Crayola felt pen worked the best on the t-shirt when they drew the organs on the t-shirt in your lovely glittery activity filled lesson. That's not to say lessons shouldn't be fun. It's not to say content shouldn't be memorable in inverted commas in an engaging way, but keep the main thing, I think would be.
I'd recommend as well, if any colleagues haven't read Peps McRae's book Motivated Teaching, he talks about the relationship between attention and motivation, and it's really interesting. He offers some very practical strategies around what you can do in order to really think about how you can boost that attention, how you can focus that attention as well.
And I think, as you said earlier, I've been making it really, really clear at the beginning, you know, so we've talked about behaviour and setting our children and young people up to succeed. It's exactly the same. What do you want me to pay attention to? And when I know that, I will pay attention to that and be more engaged in that sense. And it's that clarity of expectation. But I love that question, and I find it really helpful to reflect on in lots of scenarios, actually. Are they engaged, or are they just being well-mannered? And how do we know that? And, you know, it's brave, but when you have your mentor come and have the privilege of watching you teach, ask them. You know, ask them whether it's during the lesson, if you've got that set up, if you've got a colleague with you in the lesson, go and, if you've got a minute to go and have that conversation during that lesson, you know, do it there and then. So three key things I think to keep in mind in terms of behaviour: create the climate, have a curriculum mindset, and be absolutely consistent. No surprises. Going back to Tom with that, it's a curriculum mindset, relationships, and no surprises. And I think a key phrase for me from this entire text is certainty rather than severity. And one of the most powerful pieces of advice that anybody ever gave me with behaviour was, if you let them off, you let them down. And it is so hard, because in that moment, sometimes in lessons, when you know it is appropriate to apply a consequence, sometimes it is easier not to apply it. But I think one of the most powerful pieces of advice I was ever given was not, you know, severe consequence all the time, because it's about certainty, and that is part of building that trust and that safety. But if you let them off, you let them down. Not only that, you jeopardize the relationship and the trust that you've worked so hard to build. Love and nurture with certainty and consistency. And Abby, I'm going to come back to you with this, because it's going to bring us back to the book. But I think we both felt that this was a really powerful way to bring this to a close.
Yeah, so Zoe Enzer is one of the contributors to the book. She wrote a letter to her NQT self. And I'm going to pause for a moment to give you an opportunity to read a couple of sentences from that letter. For me, it captures a mindset that I had, many of our early career teachers have, around this idea of sometimes guilt. So, you know, when we learn something new and we think, oh gosh, why did I used to do it that way? Now I know this, I'd have never done it that way. And that's okay, that's expected, that's normal. That will continue to happen throughout the whole of your career. You know, still to this day, when I look back at things that I've been teaching for years, I always change something. I always make something better. And that's an important part of growth. I would be worried if things stayed the same. And it really reminds me of something that David Weston speaks about around holding our views lightly. So really challenging the central core things we do so that we don't become entrenched in our ideas. It's so easy sometimes to slip into this mindset of having very fixed attributions. Yeah, I've cracked this now. This is the way I'm going to do it until the end of time, because it becomes automatic, because it feels easy. And that's sometimes a dangerous place to be as a teacher. So the less entrenched we can be, the better. The more we can hold our views lightly about teaching, the better. I think it will make us better teachers too.
And also, Abby, you know, think about that, what you would want to impart upon your children and young people in your classroom is actually, it's okay to make mistakes. Give yourself the same permission and the same support and the same love.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you so much to everyone for listening. I'm not sure if you've got any questions. I can see James is here, but it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you all. And you're starting what I think, I know I'm biased, but the best career you could possibly have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Amy, as well. So really sort of insightful view on, and also from a sort of wide range of people on their own reflections. But equally, I think going back to some of the strategies that you're talking about and some of the views on how cognitive load and so forth as well. And I think in light of that, to kind of push the YouTube thing as well, because I think this is one of those sessions where it might be a case of rewatching almost sections of this, and it might be something that you want to come back to in the future as you're going through your early career as well. So it's obviously being mindful that the development continues right the way through. It isn't something that is, you know, you've done your teacher training, you're about to go into your first year of you know, fully fledged teaching, and now be in a situation where that's it, the learning stops. And I think it's kind of crucial that we recognize that and acknowledge that. And so, yeah, this is, as I say, recorded. It is going to be available on YouTube. Do go back over and watch through those smaller sections and almost chunk this if you can. I know that in terms of questions, we haven't got any posed at the moment. I've got a couple of questions that I think some of our trainees that I've spoken to are kind of anxious about, and things that are kind of themes that are coming up. But for those of you that are watching, if you do want to pose questions, you've got the opportunity just at the bottom in the Q&A tab, if there is anything you want to ask either Abby or Amy. I know that a lot of trainees, with the introduction of the early careers framework and it being something that's new to schools, as well as obviously new to themselves as well, and there is that kind of almost unknown, although it's kind of well documented within everything that exists. When trainees are sat, or not trainees, but new teachers are sat there, September the 1st rolls around, that night before, what would be your sort of go-to sort of thing to make sure that that isn't that anxiety building exercise that's going to happen? What would be the thing that you would say to new teachers to kind of get them through that first sort of day or week or first milestone?
I'll go first if that's okay, Amy. So sometimes we can get really fixated, rightly so, on, you know, my timetable, what text I'm teaching, you know, my resources. All of that is really important, but the things that derailed my first week in teaching is like not knowing the photocopier code, not having my lanyard to get through the door to get to the classroom I needed to get to, and all of those kinds of things. So what I would do retrospectively, I think, is maybe not the night before, but I would make sure that I had listed all the little things that I felt like I needed to know aside from the curriculum I'm teaching, because sometimes they're the things that add to your stress levels as you are moving between classrooms, potentially if you're a secondary teacher, or just going into that classroom, and it can create a really disruptive start, and then it really affects how you feel as you start that lesson. So it sounds really silly and simple, but they're questions that I definitely didn't ask, and I needed to know probably by 9 AM on the Monday morning of that first week. So that would be my first piece of advice there.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. And I would say, if you are fortunate enough, be as proactive as possible with your induction. So try to meet your colleagues at the earliest possible opportunity before your role has started. I know it's particularly difficult in this climate, but to visit as many times as possible and familiarise yourself as much as possible with some of those logistics. But ultimately, don't expect ever to be the finished article, but certainly not by the end of week one, and try and mitigate. You know, we talked about planning with misconceptions in mind. Try and mitigate those risks. So, you know, the silly things like, where do you put your coat if you're in a department where it's a staff room but you're moving rooms? You know, get those logistical conversations in before you actually start, if you're fortunate enough to be able to have those visits and those opportunities to do so.
Yeah, it's one of those, make a checklist of all the things that you're going to be worried about in September and get those answers before it comes. I know even now as an experienced teacher, photocopier numbers are something for me that I stress about as well. So it's not something even that's just for those of us that are starting out. So I think equally one of the conversations that I sort of quite regularly have, and as we sort of try to encourage these professional attitudes and behaviours within these sort of earlier stages of the profession, you know, the earlier careers framework sets up teachers to have a really sort of solid grounding and induction into the profession. And you've done a great job of obviously highlighting lots of texts that people can engage with to obviously enhance their sort of development further. Are there any sort of signposting that you'd give for people to sort of follow blogs or, you know, influential people that you think would be kind of markers or milestone or individuals to kind of keep an eye out on as things go forward as well?
Yeah,
obviously, I mean, yourselves.
I would definitely, and it's already been referenced, but suggest the Chartered College's Early Career Teacher Handbook. It's kind of like a one-stop shop, really. You know, it can be really hard to navigate the plethora of blogs we have on Twitter, which are all amazing, but, you know, we don't always have time to root through to try and find that gem. So what it does do is give you a really nice, pithy overview of every aspect of the framework. I really don't think you could go wrong reading that ahead of a September start. And they also have some really nice reflective questions at the end of each chapter to get you thinking about your practice. So you might revisit the book as you start to put some of this into action. I would suggest Tom Bennett's book, Running the Room. I think it's just a really great philosophy for behaviour as a curriculum in schools, and he offers some really nice practical strategies there as well. There are loads of blogs that I would recommend. Love Harry Fletcher Wood's work. I love Zoe Enzer's blogs, Mark Enzer's blogs. Love what Nick Rose writes. Yeah, there's a lot, but
Yeah.
I would start with the Early Career Teacher Handbook personally.
Yeah. Couple from me, I would say the Impact Journal from the Chartered College is fantastic, because in there you will get articles that make it tangible, give classroom examples written by colleagues in the classrooms at the chalk face in inverted commas, which I find really powerful. And I would also just really encourage colleagues to read around their subject knowledge. I think we can sometimes, we're, as Abby said earlier, we're awash with initiatives and sometimes, you know, Twitter, I absolutely adore Twitter, and it is one of the most helpful access routes to CPD. Twitter, I think, without sometimes a filter, isn't always massively helpful. And what I would really strongly encourage colleagues to do is read around their subject and subject knowledge, as well as around some of the more pedagogical approaches. I would absolutely plug all the subject associations, actually, and looking at the content in there. And Mary Myatt does a brilliantly helpful collated summary of those. So I would encourage colleagues to go and look there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Abby. We've had a question come in from Javeria. Firstly, saying thank you for obviously signposting all the resources and the insightful sort of parts from the session. One of the things that she's got a question around is obviously trying out things, trying out ideas and strategies, as sort of Zoe sort of reflects on as well. And how often or how long do we spend trialing and doing things to determine how effective they are before we move on to trying something else?
That's like a how long is a piece of string question.
Yeah.
So not to sound like I'm dodging the question, because I'm not, but it really depends on what you're trying to implement. So if I was trying to look at entrance routines into my classroom, because I'm doing it potentially 5 to 6 times a day, I might feel like I have acquired, you know, real expertise in doing that, and it's going really well quite quickly because of the frequency of it. But then there'll be other things that you're trying to do that you can't do as frequently because it's just not relevant to the curriculum enacted. So it really does depend. I would be less concerned on the length of time it takes and more focused on what it really takes to build those habits. So that deliberate practice, you know, working on something in a really granular way in the presence of an expert, but then the purposeful practice where we practice that independently, we really think you know, about the individual steps we need to take, how that's going, having those evaluative conversations. I think the discourse is a really important ingredient in getting better. So are we having conversations about the very specific things that we need to tweak potentially, but also I think the active ingredients, the things that make a particular strategy so effective, is so important. So I have seen colleagues, and been one of those colleagues in the past, who has tried something but not really understood the why of that strategy. And so until you understand what it is that's so effective, what the evidence base is, why it's impactful, sometimes we find that we're spending ages trying to acquire mastery of it, and it's not that, you know, we're not very good at it, it's just that we don't necessarily understand it and therefore don't really know how we can adapt it to different contexts.
Got Amy, I thought you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that and just say, start with the impact in mind. So whatever it is that you might be trying out, what, as Abby says, why is that? What will it look like if that is successful? And really be clear about that before you start, and seek that counsel with your colleagues. If you are fortunate enough, you know, to have LSA, TA, however they're kind of referred to in your setting, to have support staff in your classroom, you know, seek their counsel, seek their expertise, and seek their views on that. And, you know, be really clear and have that collaborative approach, but always know what it is you want to achieve more than what it is you perhaps want to try out.
I think it's a really nice way of looking at it. So it's reverse engineering that sort of idea. I think equally as well as, and Amy, you raised a really good point about the usefulness of LSAs and support staff within the classroom, and the fact that those support staff are probably very experienced members of staff who see the school in its bigger picture rather than necessarily just your classroom. So it may well be, obviously, there's you know, an expert there that might be an untapped resource that we can support with as well. So brilliant, really sort of good ideas there. I think what we'll do is, obviously, I'm going to give the last few seconds to people to sort of add any questions that they may have. I'm just going to say this is, as I say, recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube page, Chiltern Teaching School Hub, and you'll be able to find that recording in the next few days. We are obviously on Twitter as well, so if you want to share any ideas, thoughts, or engage in a discussion, obviously Amy and Abby had their Twitter handles up at the earlier start, but you'll see we've been posting tweets and so forth as well. But it doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in at this moment in time. So without much further hold up, we'll end today's session there. So thank you, Abby. Thank you, Amy, for what is a really sort of insightful view into that early career and how to strive, not just survive. Thank you, guys. Yeah.